It was January of 1887, the beginning of an event history would remember as the Big Die-Up. A winter so ferocious, it would reset the entire cattle industry of the American West. At ground level, the visibility was less than 5 feet. A suffocating wall of white powder driven by 60-mile-per-hour gusts that transformed the landscape into an alien, frozen hellscape. The mercury in the thermometers had not just dropped. It had plummeted into the impossible, registering 40 degrees below zero and threatening to go lower. In the valleys, where the wealthy ranchers had built their sprawling, fashionable 2-story houses, the situation was already becoming desperate. Nails were popping out of siding like rifle shots as the wood contracted violently in the freeze, and the expensive coal stoves were burning red-hot without raising the internal room temperature above freezing. But up on the exposed ridge, a place everyone in the territory had deemed uninhabitable suicide, a small, peculiar structure stood immovable against the gale. It was a tiny cabin, barely 400 square feet, sitting squat and dark against the blinding snow. There was no smoke belching furiously from a chimney, only a thin, efficient wisp of heat haze rising from a low vent, barely visible before the wind snatched it away. Inside, the air was not just survivable. It was warm, holding a steady 65 degrees while the world outside died. This was the home of Mei Lin, a widow who had been ridiculed by every carpenter and cattle baron in the county just 3 months prior. They had laughed at her location, sneered at her refusal to use iron nails, and bet actual gold dust that her pile of logs would collapse under the first heavy snow. But as the blizzard buried the territory in drifts that would last until May, the silence inside her cabin was the loudest vindication imaginable. If you have ever wondered how ancient engineering can outperform modern arrogance, or why sometimes the old ways are the only ways to survive, you are in the right place. Before we unlock the architectural secrets that kept her alive, make sure to subscribe, because this story changes everything you think you know about survival. To understand the miracle of that winter, we have to rewind to late September, when the sun was still warm enough to trick men into complacency. The territory was booming, and land speculation was at an all-time high. Men like Thaddeus Thorne, a cattle baron with a thick wallet and a thin understanding of the land, were buying up the lush, low-lying creek beds. It made sense on paper. The grass was thick and the water was accessible. Thorne was a man who believed in the power of industry and the superiority of modern manufacturing. He was building a grand ranch house, a balloon frame structure, the cutting edge of 1880s construction speed and efficiency. It relied on standardized 2x4 lumber and mass-produced iron nails, a symbol of civilization taming the wild. He looked at the landscape as a resource to be conquered, using money as his primary tool. In stark contrast, Mei Lin walked the land with a quiet, unsettling focus. She was a small woman, weathered by years of labor that she never spoke of, accompanied only by her nephew, Chen. Chen was a strapping young man in his 20s, strong as an ox but constantly looking over his shoulder, acutely aware of the stares they received in town. When Mei Lin pointed to a rocky, north-facing ridge that backed directly into a limestone cliff, Chen had tried to dissuade her. "Aunt?" he had whispered, conscious of the listening land agents. "The wind hits that ridge first. It is nothing but rock. We cannot farm there," but Mei Lin saw what the others missed. She saw that the limestone cliff absorbed heat from the sun all day, acting as a thermal battery. She saw that the ridge, while exposed, was solid bedrock that would not shift when the spring thaw turned the valley soil into a sinking bog. She purchased the deed for a fraction of what Thorne paid for his meadow, a sum of $80 compared to Thorne's $2,000. The mockery began the moment the first logs were delivered. Unlike the milled, uniform pine planks that Thorne was importing by train from the east, Mei Lin had ordered raw, heavy timber unstripped and dense. She didn't hire the town's framing crew, the men who could throw up a house in 3 days using hammers and box nails. Instead, she and Chen worked alone, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that infuriated the onlookers. Thaddeus Thorne, riding past on his gelding one afternoon, stopped to watch Chen painstakingly carve a complex, tongue-and-groove joint into the end of a massive log. Thorne laughed, a dry, barking sound. "You're building a puzzle box, Not a house, son, he called out, leaning over his saddle horn. By the time you fit 3 of those logs together, the snow will be up to your waist. Iron nails, boy. That's progress. That's how the West is won. Chun tightened his jaw, his grip on the chisel whitening his knuckles. But Mei Lin placed a calming hand on his arm. She looked up at Thorn, her face impassive. Iron bites the wood, she said, her voice surprisingly clear. When the cold comes, iron shrinks. Wood shrinks. But they shrink differently. The iron will let go. The wood will hold itself. Thorn had just shaken his head and ridden off, joking to his foreman that they'd have 2 frozen bodies to clear off the ridge come spring. The construction continued through October, a race against a clock that only Mei Lin seemed to hear. The logic of the cabin was entirely alien to the Western builders. The standard American cabin of the era was a drafty affair, relying on chinking, a mixture of mud and moss, to fill the gaps between roughly hewn logs. It was a constant battle against the elements. The mud would dry and crack, the wind would whistle through, and the solution was always just to build a bigger fire. Mei Lin's approach was a masterclass in forgotten physics. She wasn't building a wall. She was building a thermal envelope. The logs were not stacked round on round. They were hewn flat on top and bottom, then interlocked with such precision that a knife blade could not slide between them. This created a solid mass of wood, significantly increasing the R value or thermal resistance of the structure. But the true genius was in what she did with the floor. While Thorn was laying polished oak planks over a drafty crawlspace, a design that guaranteed freezing floors, Mei Lin and Chun were digging trenches. They laid a network of hollow clay pipes and flat stones in a serpentine pattern across the dirt floor, then buried them under a layer of packed earth and sealed it with slate. This was not just a floor, it was a radiant heating system, a concept thousands of years old but viewed as primitive by the locals. The stove wasn't a cast-iron beast sitting in the middle of the room. It was built into the wall, its exhaust directed through the floor channels before finally exiting the chimney on the far side. Every ounce of heat generated by burning wood would be trapped in the thermal mass of the floor, radiating upwards for hours after the fire died down. It was a system of extreme efficiency, designed for fuel scarcity. While the townspeople were stockpiling mountains of coal, anticipating a burn rate of 100 pounds a week, Mei Lin calculated she would need a fraction of that wood. By November, the cabin was complete, looking less like a house and more like a fortress growing out of the rock. The final touch, and the one that drew the most confusion, was the roof. Thorn's house featured a steep, high-pitched roof with expensive cedar shingles, designed to look grand and shed rain. Mei Lin's roof was low, heavily reinforced, and extended nearly 4 feet past the walls on all sides. She then commanded Chun to do the unthinkable: pile heavy sod and earth on top of the timber roof beams. The townspeople whispered that she was digging her own grave, that the weight would crush them in their sleep. "She's building a dirt cave," the general store owner joked to a crowd of customers. "Civilized folks live under wood, not dirt." They didn't understand the thermal bridging. They didn't understand that a standard roof loses 40% of a home's heat, while 18 inches of earth provides an insulation layer that rivals modern fiberglass. The atmosphere in the town shifted as December arrived. The sky turned a bruised purple hue that lingered for days, and the air grew heavy and metallic. The local wildlife, usually abundant, vanished overnight. The deer moved to the deep timber, and the birds ceased their chatter. Chan, standing outside the cabin chopping the last of the firewood, felt the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't the temperature, it was still hovering around freezing, but the pressure. The barometer in the town surveyor's office had dropped so low the needle was tapping the glass, a reading that suggested a hurricane, yet the air was dead still. Mei Lin came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the northern horizon, where a dark, distinct line of clouds was swallowing the sky. It looked like a solid wall of slate sliding over the world. "Bring the wood inside," she said, her voice devoid of panic but heavy with finality. "All of it, even the scraps." "The shed is full, Aunt," Chin replied, leaning on his axe. "We have enough for 3 months." "Bring it inside," she repeated, her eyes never leaving the dark horizon. When this hits, you will not be able to find the shed. You will not be able to find the door if you step 3 paces away. Chun didn't argue. He spent the next 4 hours hauling every log, stick, and chip of wood into the small designated alcove of the cabin. Down in the valley, the preparations were far less urgent. Thaddeus Thorne was hosting a dinner party to celebrate the completion of his main haul. The coal bins were full, the wine was breathing, and the massive cast-iron stove was roaring. The guests arrived in carriages, laughing about the Indian prophecies of a hard winter. They admired Thorne's high ceilings, unaware that those same 12-foot ceilings were currently trapping all the heat far above their heads, leaving the floor level a chilly draft trap. The storm hit at 8:15 p.m. on January 9th. It didn't start with snow. It started with the temperature. In the span of 2 hours, the thermometer at the rail station dropped from 30 degrees to 0. Then the wind arrived. It hit the valley with the force of a physical blow, shaking the balloon frame houses to their foundations. At Thorne's ranch, the dinner conversation died instantly as the entire house groaned, the timber framing creaking under the sudden pressure. A window in the parlor blew in with a shatter of glass, sending a freezing blast through the room that extinguished the lamps. Chaos erupted. Servants rushed to board up the window with tabletops, but the cold was already inside, a living thing that seemed to hunt for warmth. Up on the ridge, the impact was different. The wind struck Mei Lin's cabin, but the low, aerodynamic profile forced the gale up and over the structure. The heavy earthen roof, frozen solid, acted as an anchor, pressing the interlocking logs tighter together. There were no nails to shriek or pop. The wood compressed into the joints, making the seal even tighter. Inside, Mei Lin poured tea. The silence was absolute, save for the muffled roar of the wind, which sounded like a distant waterfall rather than a storm battering the walls. The radiant floor was warm beneath their feet. Chun sat by the small firebox, feeding it a single log. He watched the flames dance, then looked at his aunt. "It sounds like the end of the world out there," he murmured. Mei Lin took a sip of her tea. "For some," she said quietly, "it is." She knew what the physics of the valley dictated. She knew that down below, the moisture in the air was freezing instantly, creating a whiteout that would disorient a man within seconds. Unfortunately, the expensive, high-ceilinged homes were about to become iceboxes. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, the physics of survival had shifted from a battle of strength to a battle of thermodynamics. Down in the valley, Thaddeus Thorne's mansion was providing a brutal, real-time lesson in the laws of thermal bridging, a concept that modern engineers spend years studying but Thorne had dismissed as irrelevant. The thousands of iron nails he had championed, the very symbols of his industrial speed, were now betraying him. Iron is a thermal conductor, roughly 300 times more efficient at transferring heat than wood. With the outside temperature locked at 45 degrees below 0 and the wind chill pushing it to -60, every single nail head in his exterior walls was acting as a heat siphon, sucking the warmth from the interior and piping it directly into the storm. Inside the parlor, the walls looked like they had been stricken with a pox. Each nail head was covered in a distinct, white bloom of frost. The moisture from the breath of the terrified occupants was condensing on the freezing metal and turning instantly to ice. Thorne, wrapped in 3 buffalo robes and shivering violently, watched in horror as his breath misted in the air of his own living room. The grand cast-iron stove was glowing cherry red, consuming coal at a rate of 10 pounds an hour, yet the heat was stratifying. The 12-foot ceilings, designed to impress guests with their airy grandeur, were hoarding the warmth far out of reach. At head level, the temperature was a survivable 40 degrees. At foot level, where the drafty floorboards met the crawl space, it was 12 degrees. The occupants were literally freezing from the feet up. Contrast this with the thermal dynamics occurring 400 feet up the ridge. Mei Lin's cabin was functioning not as a shelter, but as a biological organism. The decision to forego iron nails for interlocking wood joinery meant there were no thermal bridges to conduct the cold. The wood, swollen slightly by the ambient moisture, had sealed the cabin into a single, airtight unit. But the true miracle was the radiant floor system. The serpentine flue beneath the slate floor had now been absorbing heat for 72 hours. The entire thermal mass of the ground beneath them, tons of rock and packed earth, was saturated with thermal energy. It didn't matter that the firebox was small. The floor itself was radiating a steady, infrared heat that warmed the objects in the room rather than just the air. The temperature gradient in Mei Lin's cabin was nearly flat. 62 degrees at the floor, 64 degrees at the ceiling. Chan sat on the raised sleeping platform, which was built directly over the final exit flue of the smoke channel, reading a book by the light of a single tallow candle. The efficiency was staggering. In 3 days, they had burned less wood than Thorn consumed in 3 hours. There was no draft, no frost on the walls, and no panic. The only sound was the rhythmic thrumming of the wind over the sod roof, a sound that felt distant and detached, like a storm happening to someone else. The psychological toll of the storm began to outweigh the physical threat as the 4th day dawned with no break in the weather. This period would later be documented by historians as the Great Die-Up, and for good reason. The noise of the wind was punctuated by a sound that haunts the diaries of every survivor from that winter: the sound of cattle dying. In the valley, thousands of open-range cattle, drifting before the wind until they hit drift fences, were huddling together for warmth. But the sheer intensity of the cold was freezing their lungs. Thaddeus Thorn could hear them over the gale, a low, collective moaning that slowly faded into silence as the herds succumbed by the hundreds. Inside his mansion, the veneer of civilization had cracked. The coal bin was empty. The beautiful oak wainscoting, imported from St. Louis at a cost of $4 a yard, was being ripped from the walls with crowbars and fed into the stove. Thorn, his face gray with soot and exhaustion, was screaming at his foreman, blaming him for not stocking more fuel. The hierarchy of wealth had evaporated. The only currency that mattered now was BTUs, and Thorn was bankrupt. He was burning his legacy to buy another hour of heat. On the ridge, the isolation was absolute, but the atmosphere was one of quiet endurance. Mei Lin knew the cattle were dying. She had told Chin days ago that the easy money of the valley was temporary. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but it was a contemplative silence, not a fearful one. Chun, however, was restless. He paced the small floor, checking the temperature of the slate with his hand. "The snow has covered the windows entirely," he said, his voice tight. "We are buried, Aunt. What if the roof breaks? What if the air runs out?" Mei Lin didn't look up from her mending. "The snow is an insulator, Chun. It is a blanket. The wind cannot strip the heat away if the snow is blocking it. As for the air, the stove draws from the outside vent. As long as the fire breathes, we breathe." She paused, then looked him in the eye. "Panic uses energy. Fear makes you cold. Sit down." It was a lesson in the conservation of metabolic energy. In a survival situation, the caloric burn of high anxiety can deplete a body's reserves faster than physical labor. Mei Lin's calm was a calculated survival strategy. She was regulating the emotional temperature of the room just as effectively as she regulated the stove. The storm broke on the morning of January 15th. The wind simply stopped, leaving a silence so profound it felt loud. Chun was the first to move. He had to force the heavy timber door open, pushing against a wall of white that had drifted 6 feet high against the entry. When he finally tunneled up and out, breaking the surface of the snow, he gasped. The world had been erased. The ridge, the valley, the fences. Everything was a smooth, undulating ocean of blinding white diamond dust under a hard, brilliant sun. The air was still lethally cold, hovering around 20 below, but the violence was gone. He looked down toward the valley floor, searching for signs of life. Usually, he would see the smoke from a dozen chimneys. Today, he saw only 2. The landscape was dotted with strange, dark mounds, the frozen carcasses of the cattle herds, standing like statues where they had died. He turned back to the cabin, where a thin, steady ribbon of smoke was rising lazily from the chimney, the only sign that the ridge was inhabited. The vindication, when it came, was not a moment of gloating, but a moment of grim discovery. 2 days later, a rescue party from the town managed to break a trail through to the Thorn Ranch. Chun and Mei Lin watched from the ridge as the sleds struggled through the drifts. Curious and concerned, Chun strapped on his snowshoes, handcrafted frames of ash and rawhide, and descended the slope. When he arrived at the mansion, he found a scene of devastation. The windows were boarded up with dining tables. The beautiful furniture was gone, reduced to ash. Thaddeus Thorn and his staff were alive, but barely. They were huddled in the kitchen, the smallest room in the house, wrapped in every rug and curtain they could find. Thorn's hands were black with frostbite. When he saw Chun standing in the doorway, healthy and warm, wearing simply a wool coat, the cattle baron didn't speak. He just stared. The arrogance was frozen out of him. He looked at the young man he had mocked, then looked at the icy ruin of his modern engineering. "Your aunt?" Thorn croaked, his voice a cracked whisper. "Is she?" "She is making soup," Chen replied simply. "She says you should come up. It is warm." The comparative breakdown of that winter provides a sobering look at the economics of wisdom versus the economics of waste. In the aftermath, the numbers painted a brutal picture. Thaddeus Thorn had spent nearly $2,500 constructing his ranch house, a fortune in 1887. He had spent another $300 on coal for a single winter. Despite this investment, the internal temperature of his home averaged 28 degrees during the crisis, and he lost nearly 40% of his cattle herd, a financial blow of roughly $10,000. He survived, but he was financially crippled. His reliance on imported materials and standard construction methods had nearly killed him. Mei Lin's numbers told a different story. Her cabin cost roughly $80 in materials, mostly for the glass windows and the stove iron. The labor cost was $0 in dollars, paid only in sweat. Her heating fuel for the entire winter consisted of 2 cords of wood, scavenged from the property, costing her nothing. During the height of the storm, her cabin maintained an average temperature of 62 degrees. But the most critical statistic was the mortality rate. While the Big Die-Up claimed nearly 60% of the cattle in Montana and hundreds of human lives across the plains, Mei Lin lost nothing. Not a single chicken, not a pound of stored vegetables, and certainly not her dignity. The science was irrefutable. Thermal mass and aerodynamic design had outperformed industrial manufacturing. The legacy of Mei Lin's cabin extended far beyond that terrible winter. While Thorn's mansion was eventually torn down in 1912, riddled with rot from the water damage sustained during the thaw, the widow's fort on the ridge stood for another 70 years. It became a local curiosity, and then, slowly, a point of study. In the 1920s, architects passed through the area and marveled at the radiant floor system, noting how it predated the modern underfloor heating systems becoming popular in the cities. They sketched the interlocking joints, realizing that the structure had actually grown stronger over time as the wood settled. Mei Lin lived there until she was 92, a quiet, formidable presence on the ridge, watching the valley fill up with new houses that, inevitably, made the same mistakes as the old ones. She never patented her design, never wrote a book, and never boasted. She simply lived. But the lesson remains, etched into the history of the West for those willing to look. We often equate modern with superior, assuming that new technology renders old wisdom obsolete. But when the grid fails, when the supply chains break, or when the mercury drops to 40 below, the laws of physics don't care about your net worth or your brand new technology. They care about insulation, thermal mass, and resilience. Mei Lin didn't survive because she was lucky. She survived because she respected the environment enough to work with it, rather than try to conquer it. It forces us to ask ourselves, in our world of smart homes and fragile infrastructure, are we building for the storm or just for the sunny days? And if you think the old ways are worth saving, hit that like button to help us keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay warm.